14-year-old boy stabbed his father, acting untouchable. Then the judge made history. The 14-year-old boy sat in that cold interrogation room like he owned it. Arms crossed, chin raised, not a single tear on his face. His father had just been rushed to the hospital in critical condition, and this child looked at the officers like they were wasting his time. When the detective leaned in and asked him one simple question, the boy laughed. He actually laughed. He told them they couldn't touch him. He said the law would protect him. He was 14, and in his mind, that made him untouchable. What this boy didn't realize was that his own phone had already betrayed him. A single deleted text message was about to resurface from the digital grave, and the words hidden in that message would make the judge do something unprecedented, something that had never been done before for someone his age. By the time this trial reached its final moments, the confidence would drain from his face, the smirk would vanish, and the sentence handed down would echo across every courtroom in the nation. He thought age was his shield. He was about to learn it was his downfall. Stories like this remind us that justice always finds its way. If you believe accountability matters, subscribe now and tell us what you think below. This is how it all began. The house sat at the end of a quiet suburban street. Trimmed hedges, a basketball hoop in the driveway, backpacks lined up by the front door like any other American home. Neighbors would later say they never heard shouting, never saw anything unusual, never imagined that behind those walls something deeply troubling was taking shape. The father was a man of discipline and routine. Early mornings, packed lunches, clear rules and firm expectations. He believed structure built character. He believed consequences shaped better people. He had no idea that his own son had stopped seeing him as a father and started seeing him as a problem. And on one quiet evening, while dinner simmered on the stove, that problem would be dealt with in the most unthinkable way. But the boy made one critical mistake, one tiny, irreversible error, and that single mistake would cost him everything he thought he was protected by. The call came in at 7:43 in the evening. A neighbor had heard something strange. Not screaming, not shouting, just a single heavy thud followed by silence. The kind of silence that doesn't feel right. When the first patrol car arrived, the front door was already open. The lights inside were on. The television was playing softly in the living room. Everything looked ordinary. Everything except for the 14-year-old boy standing in the doorway, waiting for them. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He stood there with his hands in his pockets, watching the officers approach like he had been expecting them all along. His expression was blank. His posture was relaxed. And when they asked him what happened, he simply pointed toward the kitchen without saying a word. What the officers found in that kitchen would stay with them for years. A man in his early 40s lay on the cold tile floor, unconscious and barely breathing. The paramedics would later say he had lost a critical amount of blood. A kitchen knife sat in the sink, placed there carefully, almost deliberately. It had been wiped, but not thoroughly. Traces remained. Traces that told a story the boy had not anticipated anyone would be able to read. The father was rushed to the hospital, where doctors fought for hours to save his life. Meanwhile, the boy was taken to the station, and that is when the first cracks in his confidence should have appeared. But they didn't, not even close. He walked into that interrogation room like he was walking into a classroom, bored, indifferent, untouchable. The lead detective had been working cases for over 2 decades. He had seen remorse. He had seen denial. He had seen panic and breakdowns and every shade of human emotion that comes after violence. But he had never seen this. The boy sat across from him, legs stretched out, arms folded behind his head like he was lounging at home. When the detective asked him to explain what happened, the boy sighed. He actually sighed, like the question was beneath him. He said his father had come at him first. He said he was scared. He said it was self-defense. But his eyes told a different story. There was no fear in them, no trauma, no shock, just a calm, calculated stillness that made the detective's skin crawl. This was not a child in crisis. This was something else entirely. Outside the interrogation room, the officers gathered and spoke in low voices. They had all noticed it, the way the boy held himself, the way he smiled when he thought no one was looking. One officer mentioned the knife in the sink? Why would someone in a panic stop to wash the weapon? Why would someone who had just defended themselves take the time to place it so neatly? Another officer brought up the boy's demeanor at the scene. No tears, no trembling, no desperate calls for help, just that eerie calm. The pieces didn't fit, and every officer in that hallway knew it, but they also knew something else. This boy was 14 years old, and the law had very specific rules about what could happen to children, rules that this boy seemed to understand better than anyone. Back in the kitchen, forensic investigators began their work. Every detail mattered now: the position of the knife, the pattern of the blood, the footprints on the tile. One technician noticed something unusual almost immediately. The blood spatter near the counter didn't match the boy's story. If the father had attacked first, if the boy had simply defended himself, the evidence should have shown signs of a struggle, but it didn't. The pattern suggested something far more deliberate, something planned. The technician made a note and kept working. Somewhere in this room was the truth, and the truth had a way of surfacing, no matter how carefully someone tried to bury it. By midnight, the father was in surgery. His condition was critical. Doctors warned the family that even if he survived, the road ahead would be long and uncertain. Meanwhile, the boy remained at the station, still calm, still composed. His mother had been contacted. She was on her way, confused and terrified, unable to comprehend the phone call she had just received. Her son? Her 14-year-old son? It didn't make sense. Nothing made sense. But the evidence was already beginning to tell its story, and it was a story that would soon unravel every lie the boy had carefully constructed. The detective returned to the interrogation room one final time that night. He sat down across from the boy and placed a single photograph on the table. It was an image from the kitchen. The boy glanced at it and shrugged. He still believed he was protected. He still believed his age was a shield no one could penetrate. But what he didn't know was that his phone had already been seized, and buried deep within its memory was a message that would change everything. A message he thought he had deleted forever. He was wrong. The house had always been the quietest one on the block. No loud parties, no arguments spilling onto, the lawn. No police visits in the middle of the night. It was the kind of home that blended into the neighborhood so perfectly that most people forgot it was even there. The lawn was always trimmed. The driveway was always clean. A basketball hoop stood near the garage, slightly rusted from years of use but still standing. From the outside, it looked like the American dream: a father, a son, a life built on routine and stability. But appearances, as the world would soon learn, can be the most dangerous lies of all. Behind that ordinary front door, something had been quietly unraveling for months, and no one had noticed until it was far too late. The father's name was Michael. He was 42 years old, a man defined by structure and discipline. He woke up at 5:30 every morning without an alarm. He made his own coffee, black with no sugar. He ironed his shirts the night before and laid them out in perfect order for the week ahead. Colleagues described him as dependable. Neighbors called him reserved but polite. He wasn't the type to make small talk over the fence, but he always waved. He always nodded. He kept to himself, but there was nothing suspicious about that. Some people simply preferred privacy. Michael was one of those people. He worked long hours at a logistics company downtown, managing shipments and schedules with the same precision he applied to everything else in his life. And when he came home each evening, his focus shifted entirely to his son. The boy's mother had left 3 years earlier. It wasn't a dramatic departure, no screaming matches, no custody battles that dragged through the courts. She had simply decided that the life she was living was no longer the life she wanted. She moved to another state, started over, and slowly faded from her son's daily existence. Phone calls became weekly, then monthly, then occasional. Birthday cards arrived late or not at all. Michael never spoke poorly of her. He never blamed her in front of their son, but the absence left a void that he tried desperately to fill with rules, routines, and expectations. He believed that if he kept the boy on a straight path, everything would turn out fine. He believed that discipline was love in its most practical form. He had no idea how deeply his son resented him for it. The neighbors remembered the father fondly, though none of them claimed to know him well. Mrs. Patterson, who lived 2 doors down, recalled seeing him take out the trash every Tuesday evening without fail. Mr. and Mrs. Gomez across the street. He remembered how he had helped them jump-start their car one winter morning without without being asked. He was that kind of man, quiet but helpful, distant but decent. No one had ever heard shouting from the house. No one had ever seen the boy with bruises or the father with anger in his eyes. Whatever was happening inside that home, it was invisible to the outside world, and perhaps that was the most chilling part of all. The danger had grown in complete silence. It had taken root in the spaces between ordinary moments, and by the time anyone realized something was wrong, the damage had already been done. The boy had once been close to his father. There were photographs in the living room that proved it. A fishing trip when the boy was 8, a birthday party with matching baseball caps, a Christmas morning where both of them smiled at the camera with genuine joy. But somewhere along the way, that connection had fractured. The boy grew older, the rules grew stricter, the conversations grew shorter. What was once a home filled with warmth became a home filled with tension. The father saw it as discipline, the son saw it as control, and neither of them knew how to bridge the widening gap between them. They stopped talking about anything real. They stopped understanding each other. They became strangers sharing the same roof, moving through the same rooms, eating at the same table in silence. On the evening, everything changed. Michael came home at his usual time, 6:15. He loosened his tie, placed his keys on the hook by the door, and walked into the kitchen to start dinner. The boy was upstairs in his room, door closed, headphones on. This had become their routine, coexistence without connection. Michael pulled ingredients from the refrigerator and began preparing a simple meal. Pasta, garlic bread, a salad he knew the boy wouldn't touch, but made anyway. He moved through the kitchen with the ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. The water boiled, the sauce simmered, the bread warmed in the oven. Everything was normal. Everything was exactly as it had always been. But upstairs, something was different. The boy sat on the edge of his bed staring at the wall. His phone was in his hand, a message thread open on the screen. He read the words he had typed to a friend just hours earlier, words that now felt heavier than he had expected. His heart beat faster. His jaw tightened. He heard his father's voice call from the bottom of the stairs, announcing, "Gee, that dinner was almost ready." The boy didn't respond. He stood slowly, placed the phone on his nightstand, and opened his bedroom door. As he walked down the stairs, his footsteps were silent. His face was expressionless, and in his mind, a decision had already been made. Michael stood at the stove with his back turned, stirring the pot, completely unaware that these were his final peaceful moments. The kitchen smelled like garlic and tomato. The evening light filtered through the window, and then, without warning, everything shattered. The argument started over something small. It always does. Michael had asked the boy to put his phone away during dinner. A simple request, a rule that had existed in the house for years. But that night, the boy refused. He didn't shout. He didn't storm off. He simply looked at his father with an expression that was cold and unfamiliar. Michael repeated the request, his voice calm but firm. The boy still didn't move. The air in the kitchen shifted. What had been a quiet evening moments before now carried the weight of something heavier. Something that had been building for months, maybe years, was finally rising to the surface. Michael set down his fork and asked his son what was wrong. The boy laughed. It was a short, bitter laugh that echoed off the kitchen walls. And then he spoke words that no father should ever have to hear from his child. The conversation escalated quickly after that. Michael stood from the table, trying to maintain control of a situation that was slipping away from him. He told the boy to go to his room. He told him they would talk about this later when both of them had calmed down. But the boy didn't move. He stayed seated, staring at his father with an intensity that made Michael pause. There was no fear in the boy's eyes, no guilt, no hesitation, just a quiet, simmering resolve that seemed out of place on such a young face. Michael took a step forward, reaching for the phone that still sat on the table between them. And in that moment, the boy made his move. He was faster than his father expected, faster than anyone would have expected. The kitchen knife had been sitting on the counter, left there from the dinner preparation. It was in the boy's hand before Michael even realized what was happening. What followed lasted only seconds. seconds, but it would be replayed in courtrooms and living rooms for months to come. Michael raised his hands instinctively, trying to protect himself. He called out his son's name, not in anger, but in disbelief. This couldn't be happening. This wasn't real. But the boy didn't stop. He moved with a purpose that was terrifying in its precision. There was no hesitation, no moment of doubt, just action, swift and deliberate. Michael stumbled backward, crashing into the kitchen counter. His hand reached for something to steady himself, knocking a glass to the floor. It shattered on the tile, the sound mixing with his desperate attempts to reason with his son. But the boy was beyond reason now. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and in the chaos of those few violent seconds, a father's life was changed forever. When it was over, the kitchen fell silent. The only sound was the boy's breathing, heavy and uneven. He stood in the middle of the room, the knife still in his hand, staring at what he had done. Michael lay on the floor, motionless, his shirt stained dark with blood. The pot on the stove was still bubbling. The bread in the oven was starting to burn. The ordinary world continued its ordinary rhythms, while something extraordinary and terrible had just occurred. The boy didn't scream, he didn't cry, he didn't call for help. He simply stood there for a long moment, processing the scene before him. And then, with a calmness that would later disturb everyone who heard about it, he walked to the sink. He turned on the water, and he began to wash the knife. The 911 call came 7 minutes later. Neighbors would tell police they heard nothing unusual during those 7 minutes. No shouting, no running, no desperate cries for help. The boy's voice on the recording was steady, almost flat. He told the operator that there had been an accident. He said his father was hurt. He gave the address clearly and answered questions without hesitation. When the operator asked him to stay on the line, he did. When she asked him to check on his father, he said he couldn't. His tone never wavered. His words never trembled. It was the voice of someone reciting lines from a script they had rehearsed 100 times before. The operator later told investigators that the call had unsettled her deeply. In her years of experience, she had never heard a child sound so detached in the middle of a crisis. The paramedics arrived within 8 minutes. They found the front door unlocked and the boy waiting for them in the living room. He pointed toward the kitchen without being asked. The first responders rushed past him, their footsteps echoing through the quiet house. What they found made them stop in their tracks. Michael was unconscious, lying in a pool of blood that had spread across the white tile floor. His pulse was weak but present. They worked quickly, calling for additional support, stabilizing him as best they could. The boy watched from the doorway, arms crossed, face blank. One of the paramedics glanced at him and felt a chill run down her spine. She had seen many things in her career, but she had never seen a child look so calm while their parent lay dying just feet away. The police arrived moments later. They secured the scene, separated the boy from the kitchen, and began asking questions. The boy answered each one with the same rehearsed calmness he had shown on the phone. He said his father had attacked him first. He said he was scared. He said he grabbed the knife because he thought he was going to die. But the evidence in that kitchen was already whispering a different story. The placement of the knife, the pattern of the... Meanwhile, the forensic team was finishing their work at the house. Every inch of the kitchen had been photographed, swabbed, and cataloged. The knife had been bagged as evidence, its partial cleaning only adding to the suspicion. But it was the blood spatter analysis that raised the most significant questions. If the boy's story was true, if he had simply grabbed the knife in a moment of panic and defended himself against an attacking father, the evidence should have reflected that chaos. There should have been signs of a struggle, defensive wounds on the boy, blood patterns that showed movement in multiple directions. But that wasn't what the evidence showed. The spatter was concentrated, controlled. It suggested that Michael had been stationary when the attack occurred. It suggested that the boy had approached him, not the other way around. The lead forensic analyst made a note in her report. The physical evidence does not support the subject's account of self-defense. Back at the station, Hayes decided to push harder. He placed several photographs on the table in front of the boy. Images from the kitchen, the blood on the floor, the knife in the sink, the shattered glass near the counter. He asked the boy to explain each one, and with each explanation the cracks grew wider. The boy said he had washed the knife because he was in shock, not thinking clearly, but his actions in the 7 minutes before the 911 call suggested otherwise. He hadn't called for help immediately. He hadn't hadn't tried to stop the bleeding. He hadn't run to a neighbor's house in panic. He had calmly cleaned the weapon, placed it in the sink, and waited. Those were not the actions of a traumatized child. Those were the actions of someone trying to control the narrative, someone who believed they could outsmart the system. Hayes closed his notebook and looked at the boy for a long moment. Then he asked a question that made the boy's calm flicker for just a fraction of a second. The question was simple. Had the boy known about the security camera mounted on the house across the street? For the first time since the interrogation began, the boy hesitated. His eyes shifted just slightly toward the door. His fingers twitched against the edge of the table. It was a small reaction, lasting less than a second, but Hayes caught it. The neighbor's camera had been installed just 2 months earlier, pointed directly at the street and capturing a wide angle that included the front of Michael's house. The footage from that night had already been requested. It was being reviewed at that very moment. And whatever story the boy had constructed, whatever version of events he had rehearsed in his mind, the camera had been watching. The camera had recorded everything. The boy asked if he could have some water. Hayes nodded and stepped out of the room. But before he closed the door, he saw something that confirmed every suspicion he had been building. The boy's hands were shaking. In the tech lab across the building, an officer sat in front of a monitor, scrubbing through hours of grainy footage. The timestamp read 6:47 in the evening. The front of the house was visible, lit by the fading sunlight of early evening, and there, walking up the driveway with a backpack over his shoulder, was the boy. He stopped at the door, looked around as if checking whether anyone was watching, and then stepped inside. There was nothing unusual about the image, nothing that screamed guilt, but it was what came later in the footage that made the officer sit up straight in his chair. At 7:39, just minutes before the 911 call, the front door opened again. The boy stepped outside, looked around once more, and then went back in. He had left the house, he had checked his surroundings, and then he had returned to make the call. This was not panic, this was not self-defense, this was something far more deliberate, and the footage was about to prove it. The boy's phone sat on the evidence table like a small black box of secrets. It was an ordinary device, the same model carried by millions of teenagers across the country. Cracked screen, faded case, stickers peeling at the corners. But to the investigators now gathered around it, this phone was anything but ordinary. It was a window into the mind of a 14-year-old who had done the unthinkable, and what they were about to find inside would change the entire direction of the case. The tech specialist assigned to the extraction was a woman named Karen Liu. She had spent over a decade recovering data from devices that people believed were wiped clean. Deleted messages, hidden folders, erased search histories. She had seen it all. And she knew, better than anyone, that nothing digital ever truly disappears. It simply waits to be found. The first thing Karen recovered was the search history. It stretched back several months, a digital trail of curiosity that started innocently enough. Video games, music, social media, the usual interests of a boy his age. But as she scrolled further, the pattern began to shift. Questions appeared that had no innocent explanation. How long does it take for someone to lose consciousness from blood loss? What household items can cause the most damage? Can a minor be tried as an adult for violent crimes? Each query was time-stamped. Each one painted a darker picture than the last. Karen printed the results and placed them in a folder. Her hands were steady, but her stomach was not. She had seen disturbing things in her career, but there was something uniquely chilling about watching a child's descent into darkness, one search at a time. The text messages were next. Most of them were ordinary. Conversations with classmates about homework and weekend plans, group chats filled with jokes and memes. But buried among the noise was a thread that made Karen pause. It was a private conversation between the boy and a friend, dated just 2 weeks before the attack. The messages started casually, complaints about school and parents. But then the boy wrote something that stopped Karen cold. He said he was tired of living under his father's rules. He said he wished his father would just disappear. The friend responded with a laughing emoji, assuming it was a joke. But the boy's next message made it clear he wasn't laughing. He said he had been thinking about it for a while. He said he had a plan. The friend never responded after that. Maybe they thought it was just venting. Maybe they didn't take it seriously. But those words, typed carelessly carelessly into a phone were now evidence of something far more sinister. This wasn't a spontaneous act of self-defense. This was premeditation. Karen moved deeper into the phone's memory, searching for anything that had been deliberately erased. Deleted files often left traces behind, fragments of data that could be reconstructed with the right tools, and in this case, the boy had tried to delete something significant. It was a video, short, barely 30 seconds long. The footage was dark and grainy, recorded in what appeared to be a bedroom. The boy's face was partially visible, lit by the glow of his phone screen. He was speaking directly to the camera, his voice low and steady. He talked about his father. He talked about the rules. He talked about how everything would be different soon. And then he smiled. That same smile the officers had seen in the interrogation room. That same unsettling calm. Karen saved the file and flagged it for the lead detective. This video had been recorded 3 days before the attack. 3 days before a father nearly lost his life in his own kitchen. The boy had planned this. He had documented his intentions. And he had believed, foolishly, that deleting the evidence would erase the truth. The cloud backup was the final piece of the puzzle. Like most teenagers, the boy had his phone set to automatically sync with an online storage account. He probably never thought about it. Most people didn't. But that automatic backup had preserved everything he tried to destroy. Every deleted message, every erased search, every file he thought was gone forever. Karen accessed the account using a court-approved warrant and began downloading the contents. What she found confirmed every suspicion the investigators had been building. There were notes, written in the boy's own words, detailing his frustrations with his father. There were diagrams, crude but clear, showing the layout of the kitchen. There were even timestamps, dates when the boy had researched specific topics and saved specific files. The digital evidence was overwhelming, and it painted a portrait of a young mind that had crossed into territory no child should ever enter. This was not a moment of panic. This was not self-defense. This was calculation, cold, deliberate, and undeniable. Detective Hayes received the report later that evening. He sat at his desk, flipping through page after page of printed evidence, his coffee growing cold beside him. The boy's story had already fallen apart in the interrogation room. But this was something else entirely. This was proof that the boy had thought about this for weeks, proof that he had researched, planned, and prepared, proof that when he picked up that knife, he knew exactly what he was doing. Hayes closed the folder and leaned back in his chair. He had worked hundreds of cases in his career. He had seen adults commit terrible acts without remorse, but he had never seen a child build a case against himself so thoroughly. The boy had believed his age would protect him. He had believed the law would see him as a victim, but the law was blind to age when the evidence spoke this loudly, and this evidence was screaming. The warrant for the boy's formal arrest was approved before midnight. The charges would no longer reflect a simple act of self-defense gone wrong. They would reflect intent. They would reflect planning. They would reflect a deliberate choice to cause harm. As Hayes signed the final document, he thought about the father still lying in a hospital bed, fighting for his life. He thought about the neighbors who had never suspected a thing. He thought about the mother, somewhere on a plane, rushing back to a nightmare she couldn't have imagined. And he thought about the boy, still sitting in that holding cell, still believing he was untouchable. That belief was about to be shattered. The digital footprints had spoken, and they had told the truth the boy had tried so desperately to bury. The juvenile detention center was a sprawling complex on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by chain-link fences and concrete walls painted in faded beige. It was a place designed for rehabilitation, a holding ground for young offenders who had strayed from the path but might still find their way back. Most of the kids who passed through its doors were scared, confused, desperate for someone to tell them everything would be okay. But the boy who arrived that morning was none of those things. He walked through the intake process with the same detached calm he had displayed since the night of the attack. He answered questions politely. He followed instructions without complaint. And when they led him to his temporary room, he sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall like he was waiting for a bus. The staff exchanged glances. They had seen difficult cases before, but something about this one felt different. Something about this boy made the air feel heavier. Dr. Helen Reyes was a child psychologist with over 15 years of experience experience working with juvenile offenders. She had evaluated hundreds of young people, each one carrying their own unique blend of trauma, confusion, and potential. She believed deeply in the capacity for change, in the idea that even the most troubled child could find a path toward healing. But when she opened the file on her desk that morning and began reading the details of this case, she felt a familiar unease settle into her chest. The search history, the deleted messages, the video recorded days before the attack. These were not the actions of a child acting out of fear or desperation. These were the actions of someone who had made a choice, a deliberate, calculated choice. She closed the file, took a deep breath, and prepared herself for the interview ahead. Whatever she was about to encounter, she knew it would not be ordinary. The interview room was small but comfortable, designed to put young people at ease. Soft lighting, neutral colors, a table with rounded edges and chairs that didn't feel institutional. Dr. Reyes sat on one side, her notebook open, her pen ready. The boy was escorted in a few minutes later, dressed in the standard issue clothing of the facility. He sat down across from her without being asked, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable. She introduced herself and explained why they were meeting. She told him that this was a safe space, that nothing he said would be used against him, that her only goal was to understand. The boy listened, nodded, and then asked a question that caught her off guard. He wanted to know how long this would take. He said he had been told there might be television time later, and he didn't want to miss it. Reyes wrote something in her notebook and kept her face neutral, but inside, a small alarm had begun to ring. The conversation that followed lasted nearly 2 hours. Dr. Reyes asked about his childhood, his relationship with his parents, his experiences at school. The boy answered each question with surprising articulation. He spoke about his father with a detachment that bordered on clinical. He described the rules of the house, the expectations, the consequences for failure. He talked about feeling controlled, suffocated, trapped in a life that had been designed without his input. But there was no emotion behind the words, no anger, no sadness, no regret. He recounted the events of that night with the same flatness, describing the argument, the escalation, the moment he reached for the knife. When Reyes asked him how he felt when he saw his father on the floor, the boy paused for just a moment. Then he shrugged. He said he felt relieved. He said it was like a weight had been lifted. He said his father had deserved it. The words hung in the air like smoke, refusing to dissipate. Reyes pressed further, gently probing the boy's understanding of what he had done. Did he feel remorse? Did he understand that his father might not survive? Did he grasp the severity of the consequences he now faced? The boy considered each question carefully before answering. He said he understood that what he did was considered wrong by society. He said he knew there would be consequences. But when she asked if he felt guilty, he shook his head. He said guilt was for people who made mistakes. He said he hadn't made a mistake. He had solved a problem. The way he spoke, the casual certainty in his voice, sent a chill down Reyes's spine. This was not denial. This was not shock. This was something far more troubling. This was a complete absence of the emotional responses that should accompany such an act. This was a boy who had harmed his own father and felt nothing but satisfaction. Toward the end of the session, Reyes asked one final question. She asked the boy if he had ever considered that he might get caught, that the evidence might lead back to him, that his plan might fail. The boy smiled for the first time since the interview began. It was a small smile, almost imperceptible, but it was there. He said he had thought about it. He said he had researched it. He said he knew the law was different for minors, that the system was designed to protect people his age. He said he had believed, truly believed, that even if something went wrong, he would walk away with nothing more than a slap on the wrist. He said he thought he would get away with it, and then his smile faded, just slightly, as if he was only now beginning to realize that he might have been wrong. Reyes closed her notebook slowly and thanked him for his time. She didn't say anything else. There was nothing else to say. The boy was escorted back to his room, and Reyes sat alone in the interview room for a long time, staring staring at the notes she had written. Her report would later become a key document in the case. It would describe a young person displaying significant antisocial traits, a marked lack of empathy, and a distorted understanding of right and wrong. It would note the absence of remorse, the calculated nature of his actions, and the chilling confidence with which he discussed his crimes. It would recommend further evaluation, but would also make clear that this was not a typical case of juvenile delinquency. This was something else entirely. As Reyes drove home that evening, she couldn't stop thinking about the boy's final words. He thought he would get away with it. He had planned, researched, and executed an attack on his own father, believing that his age would shield him from true accountability. But the world was watching now. The evidence was mounting, and the shield he had counted on was about to crumble. The phone call came at 3 in the morning, shattering the silence of a hotel room 2,000 miles away. Linda Parker had been traveling for work, a conference she had been planning to attend for months. She had kissed her ex-husband goodbye the week before, dropped off their son with a reminder to behave, and boarded a plane with nothing but routine on her mind. Now she sat on the edge of an unfamiliar bed, her phone pressed against her ear, listening to words that didn't make sense. Her son, her 14-year-old son, arrested, her ex-husband, in critical condition, a knife, blood, an attack in their own kitchen. She asked the officer to repeat himself, then she asked again. The words remained the same, but her brain refused to process them. This wasn't possible. This wasn't real. This had to be some kind of mistake. But the voice on the other end was calm, practiced, and horrifyingly certain. There was no mistake. Her world had just collapsed. The flight home was the longest journey of her life. She sat in a window seat, staring at the clouds below, replaying every moment she could remember. Had there been signs? Had she missed something? She thought about the last conversation she had with her son, a brief exchange about homework and weekend plans. He had seemed normal, quiet maybe, distant perhaps, but normal. She thought about Michael, the man she had once loved, the father who had stayed behind to raise their child when she couldn't. They had their differences, their disagreements, their reasons for growing apart. But he was a good man, a decent man. He didn't deserve this. No one deserved this. The tears came somewhere over the Midwest, silent and unstoppable. The passenger beside her pretended not to notice. She was grateful for that small mercy. By the time the plane touched down, she had no tears left, only questions, only a desperate need to understand, and how everything had gone so terribly wrong. The hospital was a blur of white walls and hushed voices. Linda rushed through the corridors, following signs she barely registered until she reached the intensive care unit. A nurse met her at the door, her expression gentle but guarded. Michael was stable, she was told. He had survived the surgery, but the injuries were severe, and the road to recovery would be long and uncertain. Linda nodded, absorbing each word like a blow. She was led to a small room where Michael lay motionless, surrounded by machines that beeped and hummed in a rhythm that felt both comforting and terrifying. His face was pale, his eyes were closed. Tubes connected him to bags of fluid and monitors that tracked every heartbeat. She sat beside him and took his hand, the same hand that had once held hers at their wedding, that had cradled their son as a newborn, that had built a life she had walked away from. She whispered his name, but he didn't respond. The only answer was the steady beep of the heart monitor, proof that he was still fighting, still holding on. The extended family arrived over the next few days, drawn together by tragedy in a way that nothing else could have accomplished. Michael's brother flew in from the East Coast. Linda's mother drove up from the southern part of the state. Aunts, uncles, cousins, and old friends filled waiting rooms and hotel lobbies, all of them carrying the same bewildered expression. No one knew what to say. No one knew how to make sense of what had happened. They spoke in hushed tones, trading fragments of information, piecing together a picture that none of them wanted to see. The boy, their nephew, their grandson, their cousin had done this. The child they had watched grow up, whose birthdays they had celebrated, whose school plays they had attended, had attacked his own father. The disbelief was universal. The grief was suffocating. And beneath it all, a question lingered that no one dared to speak aloud. How had they missed it? How had they all failed to see what was happening? The funeral arrangements began even though Michael was still alive. It wasn't for him. It was for the family they used to be, the life they used to have, life, the future they had once imagined. Linda found herself packing up the house, boxing away photographs and memories that now felt like artifacts from another world. She stood in her son's room for a long time, staring at the posters on the walls, the books on the shelves, the bed where he had slept just nights ago. This was where he had grown up. This was where he had become whoever he now was. She picked up a stuffed animal from his childhood, a worn bear with one missing eye, and held it against her chest. She remembered the day she had bought it for him, a reward for being brave at the doctor's office. He had been so small then, so innocent. What had happened to that child? Where had he gone? She placed the bear back on the shelf and walked out of the room, closing the door behind her. Some questions had no answers. Some grief had no end. The mother's statement to the press came a week later, delivered outside the courthouse where her son's fate would eventually be decided. She stood before a crowd of cameras and microphones, her face drawn, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She spoke about love and loss. She spoke about the impossibility of reconciling the child she had raised with the act he had committed. She spoke about Michael, his strength, his dedication, his undeserved suffering. And then she said something that made headlines across the country. She said she had lost them both that night, her husband to violence, her son to something she couldn't name. She said she didn't know how to move forward, only that she had to try. She asked for privacy. She asked for understanding. And then she turned and walked away, leaving the cameras to capture her retreating figure as she disappeared into the courthouse. Inside those walls, the next chapter of this tragedy was already being written. The community responded in waves, some offering support, others offering judgment. Neighbors left flowers on the doorstep of the house where it had happened. Strangers sent letters, some sympathetic, some cruel. Online forums debated who was to blame, dissecting every detail of the family's history, searching for explanations that might make the inexplicable feel manageable. But there were no easy answers. There was only pain, spreading outward like ripples in water, touching everyone it reached. The family that had once gathered for holidays and birthdays now gathered in hospital rooms and lawyers' offices. The bonds that had held them together were fraying, strained by grief and guilt and the weight of what had happened. And at the center of it all, a boy sat in a detention facility, awaiting a trial that would determine the rest of his life. He had wanted to solve a problem. Instead, he had shattered a family, and the pieces would never fit together again. The day of the trial arrived under a gray sky that seemed to mirror the mood of the entire city. News vans lined the street outside the courthouse, their satellite dishes pointed toward the heavens like mechanical prayers. Reporters clutched microphones and rehearsed their introductions, each one preparing to deliver the latest chapter of a story that had captivated the nation. This was not just a trial, this was a reckoning. A 14-year-old boy accused of attacking his own father in their family kitchen, a case that raised questions about youth, violence, accountability, and the limits of the law. People had been debating it for weeks, arguing in living rooms and comment sections, choosing sides before a single piece of evidence had been presented in court. Now, finally, the doors were opening, and the world was watching. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Security officers stood at every entrance, checking bags, scanning badges, maintaining order in a building that had never seen this level of attention. The gallery filled quickly, a mix of journalists, family members, curious citizens, and legal observers who had traveled from across the state to witness the proceedings. Every seat was taken. Every eye was fixed on the front of the room where two tables sat waiting for the opposing sides. The prosecution's table was neat, organized, stacked with folders and documents that represented months of investigation. The defense's table was smaller, more modest, but no less prepared. Between them stood the judge's bench, elevated and imposing, a symbol of the authority that would ultimately decide the boy's fate. The room hummed with whispered conversations, but when the bailiff called for order, silence fell like a curtain. The boy entered through a side door, escorted by two officers who walked half a step behind him. He was dressed in a suit that looked slightly too large for his frame, as if it had been borrowed or purchased in haste. His hair was neatly combed, his His face was clean. He looked in many ways like any other teenager preparing for a school photograph, but the context was anything but ordinary. This was a child facing charges that could alter the entire trajectory of his life. This was a boy who had sat in an interrogation room and smiled while his father lay bleeding. The gallery watched him walk to the defense table, searching his expression for some sign of remorse, some hint of fear. They found neither. He sat down beside his attorney, folded his hands on the table, and stared straight ahead. If he felt the weight of every gaze upon him, he gave no indication. He was, as always, unnervingly composed. Judge Catherine Morales entered the courtroom a few minutes later, her robes flowing behind her like a dark wave. She was a woman in her early 60s, known throughout the legal community for her fairness, her precision, and her unwillingness to tolerate theatrics. She had presided over some of the most challenging cases in the district's history, and she approached each one with the same steady resolve. As she took her seat at the bench, she surveyed the room with sharp eyes that missed nothing. She noted the cameras, the crowded gallery, the nervous energy that filled the air, and then she spoke, her voice calm but commanding. She reminded everyone present that this was a court of law, not a stage for public opinion. She warned against outbursts, disruptions, or any behavior that might compromise the integrity of the proceedings. Her words were directed at no one in particular, but everyone understood. This trial would be conducted with dignity, regardless of the emotion involved. The prosecution's opening statement came first. Assistant District Attorney Marcus Webb rose from his seat and approached the podium with the confidence of a man who believed completely in his case. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a voice that carried effortlessly across the room. He began by describing the night of the attack, painting a picture of an ordinary evening shattered by extraordinary violence. He spoke about the father, a man of discipline and routine, who had been preparing dinner when his own son approached him with a knife. He spoke about the evidence, the search history, the deleted messages, the video recorded days before the incident. He spoke about the 7 minutes of silence before the emergency call, the calmly washed weapon, the complete absence of panic or remorse. And then he looked directly at the jury and made a statement that would echo through every headline the following day. He said this was not a case of self-defense. He said this was not a moment of youthful confusion. He said this was a calculated act of violence, planned and executed with chilling precision by someone who believed his age would shield him from consequence. The defense responded with a different narrative. Attorney Sarah Chen was smaller in stature but no less formidable in presence. She approached the podium with a measured calm, her voice soft but steady. She acknowledged the tragedy that had occurred. She expressed sympathy for the victim, for the family, for everyone whose lives had been upended by this event. But she asked the jury to look beyond the headlines, beyond the assumptions, beyond the easy story of a villain in a child's body. She spoke about a home filled with tension, with rigid expectations, with a father whose discipline sometimes crossed into territory that felt suffocating. She spoke about a boy who had endured years of pressure, years of control, years of feeling like he could never meet the standards set for him. She did not excuse what had happened, but she asked the jury to consider the context, the environment, the factors that might have led a desperate child to a desperate act. She asked them to remember that this was still a child, a 14-year-old whose brain was not yet fully developed, whose capacity for judgment was still forming. She asked them to consider justice, yes, but also mercy. The judge called for a brief recess after the opening statements concluded. The gallery buzzed with reactions, whispered debates about which side had made the stronger case. Journalists typed furiously on laptops, sending updates to editors, waiting for the latest developments. Family members sat in stunned silence, processing the arguments that had just been laid before them. And at the center of it all, the boy remained seated at the defense table, his expression unchanged. He had listened to both sides describe his actions, his motives, his future. He had heard himself called a calculating predator by one and a troubled child by the other. But if either portrayal affected him, he showed no sign. He simply waited, patient and still, as the wheels of justice began to turn around him. The trial had officially officially begun, and the truth, buried beneath layers of argument and interpretation, was waiting to emerge. The prosecution began building its case piece by piece, like a mason laying bricks in a wall that would eventually become impossible to climb. The first witness called to the stand was Officer Daniel Reyes, the patrol officer who had been first on the scene that night. He was a man in his mid-30s, broad-shouldered and soft-spoken, with the kind of steady demeanor that came from years of witnessing things most people only read about. He described arriving at the house, finding the front door open, and seeing the boy standing in the doorway with his hands in his pockets. He described the eerie calm that radiated from the teenager, the absence of tears or trembling or any of the reactions one might expect from a child who had just witnessed violence. He described entering the kitchen and finding the father on the floor, unconscious and bleeding. His testimony was clinical, factual, stripped of emotion, but the images he painted lingered in the minds of everyone who heard them. The forensic analyst came next, a woman named Dr. Patricia Vance, who had spent 2 decades studying crime scenes and the stories they told. She approached the witness stand with a folder of photographs and diagrams, each one meticulously labeled and organized. The prosecution asked her to explain what she had found in the kitchen that night, and she began with the blood spatter patterns. Using enlarged images projected onto a screen, she walked the jury through the evidence step by step. She showed them the concentration of blood near the counter, the direction of the droplets, the absence of defensive wounds on the boy. She explained that if the father had been attacking, if the boy had truly been defending himself, the patterns would have looked different. There would have been signs of movement, of struggle, of chaos. Instead, the evidence suggested a single focused attack on a stationary victim. She delivered her conclusions with the detachment of a scientist, but the implications were devastating. The physical evidence did not support self-defense. The phone expert followed, a young technician named Kevin Park, who had been responsible for extracting the data from the boy's device. He explained the process of recovering deleted files, the way digital information leaves traces even when users believe it has been erased. He presented the search history, reading aloud the queries that had been made in the weeks before the attack, questions about blood loss, questions about household weapons, questions about the legal treatment of minors who commit serious crimes. The courtroom was silent as each search was displayed on the screen, time-stamped and undeniable. Then came the text messages, the private conversation with a friend where the boy had written about wanting his father to disappear. The prosecution asked Park to read the messages aloud, and his voice echoed through the room with uncomfortable clarity. The words hung in the air, impossible to ignore, impossible to explain away. This was not the behavior of a child acting on impulse. This was research. This was planning. This was intent. The recovered video was the most damaging piece of evidence yet. Park explained how it had been found in a cloud backup, preserved despite the boy's attempts to delete it from his phone. The prosecution asked for it to be played for the jury, and the courtroom fell into a heavy silence as the footage appeared on the screen. It was dark, grainy, recorded in what appeared to be the boy's bedroom. His face was partially visible, lit by the glow of his phone screen. He spoke directly to the camera, his voice low and steady. He talked about his father. He talked about the rules, the control, the feeling of being trapped. And then he said something that made several jurors visibly react. He said everything would be different soon. He said he had figured out a way to fix everything. He said it with a small smile, the same smile that had appeared in the interrogation room, the same smile that seemed to follow him everywhere. The video ended and the screen went dark. No one in the courtroom moved. The silence was suffocating. The defense attempted to challenge each piece of evidence, to create doubt where certainty seemed absolute. Attorney Chen questioned the forensic analyst about the limitations of blood spatter interpretation, suggesting that the patterns could be explained by other scenarios. She questioned the phone expert about the possibility of data being taken out of context, argued that search history alone could not prove intent. She even attempted to reframe the video, suggesting that it was the venting of a frustrated teenager, not a confession of premeditated violence. But with each challenge, the prosecution responded with calm precision. They called additional witnesses to corroborate findings. They presented supplementary evidence that filled gaps the defense tried to exploit. The wall of evidence grew taller with every hour, and the boy sitting at the defense table seemed smaller by comparison. His composure remained intact, but something in his eyes had begun to shift. The confidence that had carried him through the interrogation room was slowly draining away. The jury took meticulous notes throughout the testimony, their faces revealing little of what they were thinking, but small moments betrayed their reactions. A woman in the front row wiped her eyes after the video was played. A man in the back shook his head slowly as the text messages were read aloud. These were ordinary people, pulled from their ordinary lives, asked to sit in judgment of something extraordinary. They had heard the opening statements, the competing narratives of a calculating predator and a troubled child. Now they were seeing the evidence for themselves, and the evidence was speaking loudly. It spoke of research conducted in secret. It spoke of messages sent without remorse. It spoke of a video recorded with chilling calm, days before blood would stain a kitchen floor. Whatever sympathy the defense had tried to cultivate was being eroded piece by the undeniable weight of digital footprints that refused to disappear. As the day drew to a close, the prosecution announced that they would be calling their final witnesses the following morning. The judge adjourned the session, and the gallery began to empty in a slow, murmuring stream. Journalists rushed outside to deliver their updates. Family members lingered in the hallway, exhausted and overwhelmed, and the boy was escorted back to the detention facility, his suit slightly rumpled, his expression unreadable. He had sat through hours of testimony that painted him as something cold and calculating. He had watched the jury absorb evidence that left little room for doubt, but if he understood the gravity of what was unfolding, he gave no sign. He walked out of the courtroom the same way he had walked in, head held high, eyes forward, as if the entire proceeding was happening to someone else. But the evidence parade was not over yet, and the most damaging revelations were still to come. The second day of testimony began with the same heavy atmosphere that had settled over the courtroom since the trial started. The gallery was full again, every seat occupied by someone desperate to witness what would happen next. The journalists had their notebooks ready. The family members sat in their designated rows, their faces drawn with exhaustion and grief, and the boy took his place at the defense table, dressed in the same borrowed suit, his hair neatly combed, his expression as neutral as it had been the day before. But something was different. This was not a frightened child overwhelmed by circumstance. This was someone who viewed his own trial as an inconvenience, his father's suffering as irrelevant, the entire proceeding as a waste of his time. Judge Morales brought down her gavel with a sharp crack that silenced the room immediately. Her face was stern, her eyes fixed on the boy with an intensity that seemed to penetrate straight through him. She addressed him directly, her voice cold and controlled. She reminded him that he was in a court of law, that the proceedings he found so boring would determine the course of his entire life. She told him that the respect he failed to show this courtroom would not be forgotten. She warned him that any further disruptions would result in consequences he would not enjoy. The boy nodded, his smirk finally fading, replaced by something that might have been the first genuine emotion he had displayed since the trial began. It looked almost like surprise, as if he was only now beginning to understand that his act was no longer working, that the room had turned against him completely. The prosecutor rose slowly after the judge finished speaking. He didn't say anything at first. He simply stood there, letting the silence stretch, letting the weight of the moment settle over the jury. Then he turned to look at the boy, holding his gaze for a long, uncomfortable moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but carried clearly across the room. He said that the jury had just witnessed something important. He said they had seen, with their own eyes and ears, exactly who this defendant truly was. He said no amount of expert testimony or psychological analysis could have demonstrated the truth more clearly than the boy's own words and actions. Then he sat down, leaving the statement hanging in the air like a verdict already delivered. The defense attempted to recover, just to redirect attention, to remind the jury of the context and the complexity, but it was too late. The mask had slipped, and everyone in that courtroom had seen what lay beneath it. The final day of arguments arrived with a weight that seemed to press down on everyone who entered the courtroom. The sky outside was overcast, the light filtering through the tall windows in pale muted tones. The gallery was packed tighter than it had been on any previous day, with people standing along the back wall and crowding the doorways just to catch a glimpse of what was about to unfold. This was the moment everything had been building toward. The evidence had been presented. The witnesses had spoken. The boy's mask had slipped in front of the entire room. Now it was time for both sides to make their final appeals, to weave together everything the jury had seen and heard into a narrative that would guide their decision. The stakes could not have been higher. A young life hung in the balance, and the words spoken in the next few hours would echo far beyond the walls of this courtroom, about a mother who had left, creating a void that was never properly filled. She spoke about a child whose cries for help had been expressed in the only way he knew how, through research and fantasy, never truly believing he would act on them. Chen's voice softened as she continued, taking on an almost pleading quality. She reminded the jury that they were dealing with a 14-year-old, a child whose brain was still developing, whose capacity for judgment and impulse control was not yet fully formed. She cited research on adolescent psychology, studies showing that young people were more susceptible to poor decision-making, more likely to act without fully understanding the consequences. She acknowledged that none of this excused what had happened, but she argued that it should inform how the jury thought about appropriate consequences. She asked them to consider rehabilitation over pure punishment, to remember that even the most troubled young person still had the potential for change. She asked them to look at the boy sitting at that table and see not just a defendant, but a child who had lost his way and desperately needed guidance back to humanity. Her closing words were carefully chosen. She did not ask for forgiveness or leniency in the traditional sense. She asked for wisdom. She asked the jury to balance the demands of justice with the recognition that this was still a young life, a life that could potentially be redirected if given the right intervention. She reminded them that their decision would not only affect the boy, but would set a precedent for how society treats its youngest offenders. She thanked them for their patience and their thoughtfulness, expressed confidence in their ability to reach a just decision, and returned to her seat. The room was silent for a long moment after she finished. The two narratives had been laid out, calculating predatus. R versus troubled child, accountability versus rehabilitation. Now, it was up to 12 ordinary citizens to decide which story they believed. The judge turned to the jury and began delivering her instructions. The waiting was about to begin. The jury filed out of the courtroom in a single line, their faces revealing nothing of what they were thinking. 12 ordinary people, pulled from their ordinary lives, now carried the weight of a decision that would shape the future of everyone involved in this case. They disappeared through a side door, and the heavy wood closed behind them with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire building. And then, silence. The kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes you aware of your own heartbeat. The attorneys gathered their papers. The gallery shifted restlessly in their seats. The boy remained at the defense table, his hands folded, his eyes fixed on some invisible point in the distance. The waiting had begun, and no one knew how long it would last. The first hour passed slowly, each minute stretching like taffy pulled between uncertain hands. People spoke in hushed whispers, afraid to break the fragile tension that hung over the room. Journalists typed quietly on their laptops, preparing multiple versions of stories depending on the outcome. Family members sat in clusters, drawing comfort from proximity even when words failed them. Michael's brother paced the hallway outside, unable to sit still, unable to do anything but move. Linda sat alone in a corner of the gallery, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes red from tears she had stopped trying to hide. She watched the door through which the jury had disappeared, as if staring at it long enough might reveal what was happening on the other side. But the door remained closed, the silence remained unbroken, and the minutes continued to crawl by with agonizing slowness. The boy's demeanor during the wait was studied by everyone who remained in the courtroom. Some watched openly, unable to look away from the teenager whose fate was being decided behind closed doors. Others stole glances when they thought no one was looking, searching for any crack in the composed exterior he had maintained throughout most of the trial. For a while he seemed as calm as ever, sitting quietly beside his attorney, occasionally whispering questions that received brief, reassuring reassuring responses, but as the hours stretched on, something began to change. His posture shifted. His fingers tapped against the table in an irregular rhythm. He asked to use the restroom twice within 30 minutes. The confidence that had carried him through interrogations and testimony was finally beginning to waver. The reality of his situation, held at bay for so long by his own belief in invincibility, was starting to sink in. The jury was taking longer than expected, and in that extended silence, doubt was finding room to grow. Outside the courthouse, the world continued to watch. News trucks remained parked along the street, their crews ready to broadcast the verdict the moment it was announced. Social media buzzed with speculation, armchair analysts dissecting every piece of evidence, predicting outcomes with the certainty of people who had nothing at stake. Hashtags trended, opinion pieces were published. The case had become more than a trial. It had become a national conversation about youth, violence, accountability, and the limits of the justice system. People who had never met the boy or his father felt entitled to strong opinions about what should happen next. They debated in comment sections and argued at dinner tables, turning a family tragedy into content for consumption. But inside the courthouse, where the real consequences would be felt, there was only silence and waiting. The afternoon sun began to fade, casting long shadows through the windows as the hours continued to pass. The judge had retired to her chambers, available if the jury had questions, but otherwise waiting like everyone else. The attorneys made small talk in the hallway, their professional rivalry temporarily suspended by the shared uncertainty of the moment. The gallery thinned slightly as some observers stepped out for food or fresh air, but most remained unwilling to miss the moment when the door finally opened. Linda hadn't moved from her seat. She had refused offers of coffee, of food, of company. She simply sat and waited, trapped in a purgatory of her own making, forced to confront the dual loss that had shattered her life. Whatever verdict came through that door, she would still have lost her husband to violence and her son to something she couldn't understand. There was no outcome that would make her whole again. As evening approached, word spread through the courthouse that the jury had requested dinner. This was interpreted in different ways by different people. Some saw it as a sign of thorough deliberation, a jury taking its responsibility seriously. Others worried it meant disagreement, a group unable to reach consensus despite the overwhelming evidence. The boy's attorney tried to frame it positively, suggesting that careful consideration was better than a rushed decision. But the boy himself seemed unable to find comfort in any interpretation. He had stopped whispering questions. He had stopped tapping the table. He simply sat, staring at the door, waiting for it to open and deliver the news that would define the rest of his life. For the first time since this entire ordeal began, he looked his age. He looked like a frightened 14-year-old who had finally realized that the game he thought he was playing had very real consequences. The call came at 7:43 in the evening, almost exactly 12 hours after the jury had begun deliberating. A bailiff entered the courtroom and announced that a verdict had been reached. The words spread through the building like electricity, drawing people back to their seats, silencing conversations mid-sentence, focusing every ounce of attention on the door through which the jury would soon emerge. The boy straightened in his chair. His attorney placed a hand on his shoulder. Linda closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The judge returned to the bench, her face as unreadable as it had been throughout the trial. And then the door opened, and 12 ordinary people filed back into the courtroom, carrying with them a decision that would echo through this family, this community, and this nation for years to come. The foreman held a single piece of paper in his hands. The room fell absolutely silent, and the moment of truth finally arrived. The foreman stood slowly, the piece of paper trembling almost imperceptibly in his hands. He was a man in his late 50s with graying hair and the weathered face of someone who had seen his share of difficult days. But nothing in his life had prepared him for this moment. He had been chosen by his fellow jurors to speak for all of them, to deliver words that would change lives forever. The weight of that responsibility was visible in every line of his face, in the careful way he held himself, in the deep breath he took before opening his mouth to speak. The judge asked if the jury had reached a verdict. The foreman nodded. His voice, when it came, was steady but quiet, forcing everyone in the room to lean forward and strain to hear. He confirmed that they had reached a unanimous decision. The judge instructed him to read the verdict aloud. The courtroom held its collective breath. Every eye was fixed on the foreman, every ear tuned to catch the words that would emerge from his lips. The journalists had their fingers poised over keyboards, ready to transmit the news to a waiting world. The family members gripped each other's hands, bracing for impact regardless of which direction it came from. Linda sat frozen in her seat, her eyes closed, her lips moving in what might have been a prayer. At the defense table, the boy sat rigid, his earlier composure now replaced by something that looked almost like fear. His attorney placed a steadying hand on his arm, but the gesture seemed to provide little comfort. The moment stretched like a rubber band pulled to its breaking point. And then, finally, the foreman spoke the words that would echo through this courtroom and beyond. Guilty. The word fell like a hammer, heavy and final, crushing any remaining hope the defense might have harbored. The foreman continued reading, confirming the specific charges, the unanimous agreement of all 12 jurors, the conclusion they had reached after careful deliberation. But for most people in the room, everything after that first word was just noise. Guilty. The boy had been found guilty. The evidence had been believed. The prosecution's narrative had prevailed. The 14-year-old who had sat in an interrogation room and smiled, who had whispered about being bored during his own trial, who had believed until the very end that his age would protect him, had just been convicted of a crime that would follow him for the rest of his life. The system he had counted on to shield him had instead held him accountable. The law he thought he understood had spoken in a voice he could no longer ignore. The gallery erupted in a wave of muffled reactions. Gasps punctuated the air like small explosions. Someone let out a sob that was quickly stifled. Whispers spread through the rows of spectators, people turning to each other to confirm what they had just heard, as if the word might have meant something different if spoken aloud. Again, Michael's brother dropped his head into his hands, his shoulders shaking with relief or grief or some complicated mixture of both. Linda remained motionless, her eyes still closed, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. She had known this moment was coming. She had prepared herself for it as best she could. But nothing could truly prepare a mother to hear her own child declared guilty of such a terrible act. The verdict confirmed what the evidence had shown, but it also confirmed her worst nightmare. Her son was not who she had believed him to be, and that realization was a wound that would never fully heal. The judge called for order, her gavel striking the bench with sharp authority. The murmurs subsided, replaced once again by that heavy pressing silence that had characterized so much of this trial. She thanked the jury for their service, for their careful attention to the evidence, for their willingness to shoulder such a difficult responsibility. She acknowledged the gravity of the decision they had reached and assured them that their deliberation had been conducted with integrity and thoroughness. Then she turned her attention to the defendant, her eyes meeting his across the length of the courtroom. She informed him that sentencing would take place in 2 weeks, giving both sides time to prepare their arguments and recommendations. She reminded him that he would remain in custody until that time, and then she asked if he had anything he wished to say. The boy looked up at the judge, and for a long moment it seemed like he might actually speak. His mouth opened slightly. His eyes, which had been so flat and unreadable throughout the trial, flickered with something that might have been the beginning of genuine emotion. The room waited, hungry for any sign of remorse, any acknowledgement of the pain he had caused, any indication that somewhere beneath that cold exterior was a human being capable of understanding what he had done. But the moment passed. The boy closed his mouth, shook his head almost imperceptibly, and looked back down at the table in front of him. Whatever had stirred behind his eyes retreated back into hiding. He had nothing to say, or perhaps he simply didn't know how to say it. Either way, the silence that followed felt like its own kind of verdict, a confirmation of everything the prosecution had argued about who this defendant truly was. The judge adjourned the proceedings, and the courtroom began to empty with the slow, exhausted movements of people who had been holding tension in their bodies for far too long. The boy was escorted out through the side door, his borrowed suit now wrinkled, his neatly combed hair falling across his forehead. He didn't look back at the gallery. He didn't search for his mother's face in the crowd. He simply walked, one foot in front of the other, toward whatever awaited him next. The journalists rushed outside outside to deliver their reports. The family members lingered in the hallway, unsure of where to go or what to do now that the moment they had been dreading had finally arrived. And somewhere in the building, the jury members gathered their belongings and prepared to return to their ordinary lives, forever changed by the extraordinary responsibility they had just fulfilled. The verdict had been delivered, but the story was not yet over. The sentencing still loomed ahead, promising one final chapter in a tragedy that had already claimed so much. 2 weeks passed like a held breath, suspended between the verdict and the final reckoning that awaited. The courthouse felt different on the morning of sentencing, charged with a finality that had been absent before. The crowds had returned, larger than ever, spilling onto the sidewalks and filling the hallways with a low hum of anticipation. News cameras lined the street in greater numbers, their operators jostling for position, everyone aware that today would produce the images and sound bites that would define this case for years to come. Inside, the gallery filled quickly, the familiar faces taking their familiar seats, all of them drawn back to this room one last time to witness the conclusion of a story that had consumed them for months. The boy would learn his fate today, and the judge would have the final word. Judge Catherine Morales entered the courtroom with the same measured stride she had displayed throughout the trial. Her robes flowed behind her as she took her seat at the bench, her face composed but carrying a weight that seemed heavier than before. She had presided over countless sentencings in her career, had delivered words that sent people to prison for decades, had watched defendants collapse in despair and families erupt in conflicting emotions. But this case was different. This defendant was 14 years old. The crime was against his own father. The questions raised by this trial touched on fundamental issues of accountability, rehabilitation, and the capacity of young people to understand the consequences of their actions. Whatever sentence she delivered today would be scrutinized, debated, and dissected by legal scholars and ordinary citizens alike. She understood the weight of this moment, and she was prepared to bear it. The boy was brought in through the same side door he had used throughout the trial. He looked different today, smaller, somehow as if the 2 weeks of waiting had diminished him in ways that were visible to the naked eye. His suit hung more loosely on his frame. His face was pale, marked by shadows beneath his eyes that suggested sleep had not come easily. The confidence that had defined his presence in the early days of the investigation was now entirely absent, replaced by something that looked almost like resignation. He took his seat at the defense table beside his attorney, who offered a few whispered words of encouragement that seemed to provide little comfort. The boy nodded without looking up. Whatever happened next, he seemed to understand that his fate was no longer in his own hands. The time for manipulation and performance had passed. The prosecution presented their sentencing recommendation first. Assistant District Attorney Marcus Webb rose and addressed the court with the same measured intensity he had displayed during the trial. He spoke about the severity of the crime, the calculated nature of the planning, the complete absence of remorse demonstrated by the defendant throughout the proceedings. He acknowledged the defendant's age, but argued that the evidence had shown a level of premeditation and emotional detachment that transcended typical adolescent behavior. He recommended that the court impose the maximum sentence allowable under the law for a juvenile offender, with provisions for potential transfer to adult facilities upon reaching the appropriate age. He spoke about the need to protect society, to send a message that such crimes would not be tolerated regardless of the perpetrator's age. And he spoke about the victim, still recovering from injuries that had nearly claimed his life, who deserved to see meaningful accountability for what had been done to him. The defense presented their recommendation next. Attorney Sarah Chen stood and spoke with a voice that carried notes of genuine plea beneath its professional composure. She did not dispute the severity of the crime or attempt to minimize what had happened. Instead, she focused on the question of what kind of sentence would best serve the interests of justice and society. She argued for a sentence that prioritized rehabilitation, that recognized the defendant's young age and still developing brain, that left open the possibility of eventual reintegration into society. She cited research on juvenile justice, studies showing that harsh sentences for young offenders often produced worse outcomes than interventions focused focused on treatment and education. She asked the court to consider that this defendant, despite the terrible thing he had done, was still a child with a lifetime ahead of him. She asked for wisdom, for balance, for a sentence that acknowledged the gravity of the offense while preserving the possibility of redemption. Judge Morales listened to both sides without interruption, her expression revealing nothing of her thoughts. When the attorneys finished their presentations, she sat in silence for a long moment, her eyes moving slowly across the courtroom as if taking in every face, every expectation, every hope and fear contained within these walls. Then she turned her attention to the defendant and spoke directly to him for the first time since the trial began. Her voice was calm but carried an authority that commanded absolute attention. She told him that she had thought long and hard about this case, that she had considered every piece of evidence, every argument, every factor that might inform an appropriate sentence. She told him that she understood he was young, that his brain was still developing, that many people believed he deserved a chance at rehabilitation. And then her voice hardened, taking on an edge that made everyone in the room sit up straighter. She spoke about accountability. She spoke about the choices he had made, not in a single moment of panic, but over days and weeks of careful planning. She spoke about the father who had loved him, provided for him, and been rewarded with violence that nearly ended his life. She spoke about the behavior the defendant had displayed throughout the investigation and trial, the smirking, the eye-rolling, the whispered complaint about being bored while his own fate hung in the balance. She said that rehabilitation required a foundation of remorse, a recognition that what one had done was wrong, a genuine desire to change. And she said that in all her observations of this defendant, she had seen no evidence of that foundation. She had seen calculation. She had seen manipulation. She had seen a young person who viewed the justice system as a game to be won rather than a process to be respected. And then she delivered the sentence that would make headlines across the nation. The boy would be committed to a secure juvenile facility until his 21st birthday, at which point his case would be reviewed for potential transfer to adult custody. The sentence was among the harshest ever imposed on someone his age in the state's history, a reflection of the severity of the crime and the court's assessment of the defendant's character. As the words settled over the courtroom, the boy's face underwent a transformation that would be captured by every camera in the room. The mask that had flickered throughout the trial finally fell away completely. His eyes widened, his jaw went slack, the color drained from his cheeks as the reality of what he had just heard penetrated the walls he had built around himself. For years he had believed he was untouchable. In this moment he finally understood that he was not. The smirk that had haunted this case from its very first moments was gone. In its place was the face of a frightened child who had just learned that actions have consequences, and that some consequences cannot be escaped. The courtroom emptied slowly after the sentence was delivered, people filing out in a daze as if emerging from a dream they weren't sure had really happened. The journalists rushed to their cameras and keyboards, eager to be the first to report the historic ruling. The legal analysts began preparing their commentary, dissecting every word the judge had spoken, debating whether the sentence was too harsh or not harsh enough. But for the people at the center of this tragedy, there was no rushing, no analysis, no debate. There was only the heavy, exhausted silence of a journey finally reaching its end. Michael's family gathered in the hallway, embracing each other with the desperate grip of people who had survived something terrible and weren't quite sure how to move forward. Linda remained in her seat long after everyone else had left, staring at the empty space where her son had been sitting moments before. A bailiff eventually approached and gently told her the courtroom needed to be cleared. She nodded, rose slowly, and walked out without looking back. The community's reaction to the sentence was swift and divided. Some praised Judge Morales for her courage, for refusing to let age become a shield against accountability, for recognizing the calculated nature of the crime and responding accordingly. They pointed to the evidence, the planning, the complete absence of remorse, and argued that the sentence was exactly what justice required. Others condemned the ruling as excessive, as a system failing a troubled child who needed treatment rather than punishment, as proof that America had lost its capacity for mercy when it came to young offenders. The debate raged across social media, in in newspaper opinion sections, on cable news panels where experts argued passionately for opposing positions. But for all the noise and controversy, one fact remained unchanged. A 14-year-old boy was now in custody, facing years behind walls and fences, separated from a world he had thought he could manipulate into giving him whatever he wanted. Michael survived. The doctors called it remarkable, a testament to his physical strength and the skill of the surgical team that had worked through the night to save him. The recovery was long and painful, marked by setbacks and small victories, by physical therapy sessions that left him exhausted and quiet nights that left him haunted. He never spoke publicly about what had happened. He never gave interviews or issued statements or tried to shape the narrative in any direction. He simply focused on healing, on rebuilding a life that had been shattered in his own kitchen on an Ord. In airy evening, friends and family rallied around him, providing the support network he needed to navigate the darkest chapter of his existence. But some wounds cannot be healed by surgery or therapy. Some wounds live in the mind and the heart, revisiting in quiet moments, reminding the bearer that the world is capable of cruelty that defies understanding. Linda returned to her life in another state, though nothing about that life felt the same as before. She had lost her son, not to death, but to something perhaps even more difficult to comprehend. She had watched him become someone she didn't recognize, had sat in a courtroom and heard evidence that painted a portrait of a stranger wearing her child's face. The guilt was overwhelming, a constant companion that whispered accusations in her weakest moments. Had she caused this by leaving? Had she missed signs that might have led to intervention? Could she have done something, anything, to prevent this tragedy from unfolding? The questions had no answers, or at least none that provided comfort. She attended therapy, joined support groups for parents of troubled children, tried to find meaning in an experience that seemed designed to resist it. But the loss remained, a hole in her life that nothing could fill. Experts weighed in from every direction, using the case as a lens through which to examine larger questions about youth, violence, and accountability. Psychologists discussed the warning signs that had been missed, the importance of early intervention, the need for better mental health resources in schools and communities. Legal scholars debated the appropriateness of harsh sentences for juvenile offenders, the tension between punishment and rehabilitation, the role of the justice system in responding to crimes committed by children. Educators called for better training in recognizing troubled students. Parents wondered how to protect their own families from similar tragedies. The case became a catalyst for conversation, a reference point in ongoing debates about how society should respond when its youngest members commit its most serious offenses. But all the analysis and commentary in the world could not change what had already happened. It could only hope to prevent it from happening again. The boy served his time in a facility designed for juvenile offenders, surrounded by others who had made terrible choices at young ages. What happened to him there, who he became behind those walls, remained largely hidden from public view. Occasional reports emerged over the years, fragments of information that painted an incomplete picture of his journey through the system. Some suggested he had shown signs of genuine change, of remorse that had been absent during the trial. Others suggested he remained the same calculating presence he had always been, simply better at hiding it. The truth, as always, was proba. Lie somewhere in between, a complicated mixture of growth and stagnation, insight and denial, progress and setback. His story continued even after the cameras moved on and the public attention faded, but it continued in shadows, away from the spotlight that had once illuminated his every expression. Justice, in the end, meant different things to different people. For the prosecution, it meant accountability, a confirmation that the system could respond appropriately even when the perpetrator was young and the circumstances were complicated. For the defense, it meant something more ambiguous, a recognition that their client faced consequences, but also questions about whether those consequences would ultimately serve anyone's best interests. For the family, justice was both a relief and an inadequate remedy, a necessary step that could never undo what had been done or restore what had been lost. And for the boy himself, justice meant confronting a reality he had spent his entire young life trying to avoid. Boyd. He had believed he was special, untouchable, exempt from the rules that governed everyone else. The courtroom had taught him otherwise. The sentence had confirmed it. He thought his age was a shield. He thought the system would protect him. He thought he could smile his way through anything. He was wrong. The law had spoken, and the smirk that had once seemed permanent was finally, completely gone.